The year was 1841 Virginia, land of rolling tobacco fields that stretched toward the horizon like a green ocean. The Carter Plantation was among the largest in the county, a world built on broken backs and stolen lives. Its white-columned house stood proudly on a hill, watching over the cabins below, where rows of enslaved families lived in cramped, airless shacks of wood and mud. In one of those cabins, Sarah took her first breath. Her mother, Ruth, cradled her in trembling arms, sweat dripping down her brow. The midwife, an older slave named Mama Lottie, whispered encouragement while keeping her ears alert for the sound of boots on the dirt road. A birth among slaves was not a cause for joy in the Carter household. It was a cold business transaction. Another body to work the fields. Another mouth to feed cheaply. Another name to inscribe in the master's ledger. The overseer had already noted Sarah's arrival before her mother could even wipe her tears. She was born not into freedom, but into debt. Into chains that clinked louder than her first cry. Her earliest years were shaped by that reality. By the time she could walk, Sarah knew the sound of a whip cutting air. She knew the heavy ring of iron keys at Overseer Daniels's belt. She knew how to keep her eyes down when the master passed, and how to hush her voice to nothing when the white children played nearby. The Carter boy, William, often rode past her on a pony, his boots gleaming, his cheeks flushed with health. He barely noticed her at first, except to mock the rags she wore, or the way she stumbled after carrying water. Her days were a blur of small tasks suited for a child: hauling buckets, gathering kindling, plucking weeds from the garden. Her stomach growled more often than it was full. Meals were nothing more than cornmeal mush, a few beans, or, if they were lucky, scraps of pork rind from the Carter table. Even as a child, Sarah learned to eat quickly, guarding her bowl as if someone might snatch it away at night. She lay beside her mother on the dirt floor of their cabin, listening to the sounds of the night. Sometimes it was the creak of the trees. Sometimes the drunken laughter of white men drifting from the big house. And sometimes, too often, it was the crack of the whip under the stars. Her mother would hum then, low and steady, African songs passed down from her own mother who had once crossed the ocean in chains. Those melodies carried sorrow, but they also carried memory of a world beyond slavery. A world Sarah could barely imagine. Her father was a ghost she never knew. Sold south before Sarah's birth, he lived only in fragments of stories her mother whispered. How he was tall, strong, and had a laugh that could lift the heaviest day. Sarah clung to those words, building a picture in her mind of a man she would never see. The absence became part of her identity, a hollow ache that deepened each year. Life on the Carter Plantation revolved around tobacco. The smell of it filled the air, clung to clothes, and seeped into skin. Even as a child, Sarah helped strip leaves or tie bundles, her tiny hands raw from the sticky tar that oozed onto her fingers. She grew up watching men and women stagger under the sun, their sweat dripping into the earth they could never claim as their own. Punishment was never far away. She witnessed it too young. A man tied to a post, his back shredded until blood soaked the dirt. Sarah's small hands clutched her mother's skirt as she trembled, but Ruth forced her to look. "Don't forget," she whispered. "This is what they do. You must learn to endure." Endurance became Sarah's first lesson in life. There were no toys, no schooling, no laughter of childhood games, only work and fear. Yet within that darkness there were sparks of resistance. Mama Lottie taught Sarah to hum secret hymns while working, disguising them as harmless tunes. Older boys told whispered tales of freedom in the North, where a person could walk without fear of the lash. And Ruth, despite her weary body, reminded Sarah each night that she was more than what the Carter family saw. "They own your body," she said softly, "but never let them own your soul." It was a fragile hope, but it kept Sarah breathing. By the age of 9, Sarah had already grown thin and wiry, her eyes older than her years. The Carter boy, William, had begun to notice her more, not as a person, but as a figure to toy with. He was only a few years older, but he already understood his power. His boots tracked mud into the slave quarters as if the ground itself belonged to him. He would tug Sarah's braids, call her names, and demand she fetch things just to laugh when she tripped. His laughter was not childish. It was sharp, cruel, a reflection of the world he was being groomed to inherit. Sarah never forgot the day he threw an apple core at her head, laughing as she bent to pick it up. She stood there for a moment, holding it in her hands, her stomach starving, her pride burning. To eat it was humiliation. To throw it aside was defiance. She chose to eat because hunger hurt more than shame. William clapped his hands, triumphant in her submission. That night, Sarah cried quietly, burying her face in her mother's chest, feeling for the first time the cruel weight of a boy's fascination, and so her childhood ended. Not with a celebration, not with freedom, but with the tightening of chains she had worn since birth. Asterisk. Asterisk. The summer sun of 1844 burned mercilessly over the Carter plantation. The fields shimmered with heat, and the air was thick with the smell of tobacco leaves baking in the open. At 14, Sarah was no longer spared from the hardest labor. Childhood had ended, if it had ever truly begun. She rose before the rooster's crow, her stomach empty, her body already aching before her day began. The tobacco fields were endless rows of green, plants rising tall and sticky with resin. Sarah's fingers turned black from sap as she stripped the broad leaves, piling them into baskets until her small frame trembled under the weight. Her bare feet sank into the hot, cracked earth, every step grinding dust into her skin. Overseer Daniels ruled the fields with a whip always coiled at his side. He was a thick, broad man with a face hardened by cruelty. The slaves feared him more than the master himself, for Daniels had no restraint. He cursed, spat, and swung his whip with relish. When Sarah faltered, his shadow fell over her like a storm. One afternoon, as the sun blazed overhead, Sarah stumbled while carrying a bundle too heavy for her thin arms. The leaves spilled onto the dirt. Daniels's eyes narrowed. "Pick it up," he barked. Sarah scrambled to gather the leaves, her hands shaking. Too slow, Daniels growled, and before she could rise, the whip cracked across her back. Pain exploded, sharp and burning. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. Slaves learned quickly that tears only fed the overseer's satisfaction. But the second lash tore the silence from her throat. A scream ripped free, echoing across the field. The others bent their heads, their faces etched with helplessness. To stop working meant risking the same punishment. Sarah clutched the leaves to her chest, staggering to her feet, her back a canvas of fire. Daniel sneered, satisfied, and moved on. From the edge of the field, William Carter watched. Now 16, he had grown taller, his face sharper, his confidence bolder. He leaned lazily against a fence post, his fine coat slung over one shoulder. Where others might have looked away in discomfort, William grinned. Watching Sarah's suffering was, to him, a form of entertainment. That night, Sarah returned to her cabin in agony. Her mother, weary but tender, tore strips of cloth and pressed them to the bleeding welts. The pain was unbearable, but Sarah clenched her teeth, refusing to whimper. She didn't want William or Daniels, or anyone to know how deeply they had cut her. Mama Ruth, the old cook, slipped into the cabin with a pouch of herbs. She mixed a paste of crushed roots, spreading it gently over Sarah's back. "This will ease the burn," she whispered. "Don't let them break you, child. They can tear your skin, but they can't touch your soul." But Sarah felt broken. The pain was not only in her flesh, but in her spirit. She lay awake, staring at the flickering flame of the candle, remembering the smirk on William's face as he watched her bleed. The humiliation burned hotter than the whip. The next day brought no reprieve. Daniels pushed the slaves harder, shouting that the Carter family expected record harvests. The work was relentless, the air thick with sweat and dust. By evening, the slaves gathered the harvested leaves into curing barns, where fires smoked beneath hanging bundles. Sarah's task was to stoke the fire's hot choking work that left her lungs raw. The barn glowed orange in the dark, shadows flickering against the walls. William appeared again, stepping into the smoke-filled barn as Sarah worked. His pale face glistened with sweat, but his smile was cruel. "Still standing after yesterday?" he asked mockingly. "I thought Daniels might have whipped the life out of you." Sarah kept her eyes on the fire, her body trembling. She knew better than to answer. "Look at me when I speak," William demanded, stepping closer. He reached out and grabbed her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. His grip was rough. It's not the playful tug of a child anymore, but the tightening control of a young man learning to wield power. "You're strong," he said, almost to himself. "Stronger than most? But I'll make sure you remember who you belong to." He shoved her back against the wall, the heat of the fire scorching her skin. For a moment, Sarah thought he might push her into the flames. Instead, he leaned close, his voice low. "Don't forget you live because we let you." Then he turned and left. His boots crunching against the dirt floor, Sarah slid down the wall, her breath ragged, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed. She stared at the fire, its flames licking the tobacco leaves overhead. In that moment, she felt the weight of her chains heavier than ever. But beneath the despair, something small stirred, a spark of anger, of defiance. The whip could tear her flesh. The fire could scorch her lungs. William could humiliate her until she felt like nothing. But deep inside, Sarah swore she would never let them kill the last piece of her that still belonged only to herself, only to herself. The summer sun of 1844 burned mercilessly over the Carter plantation. The fields shimmered with heat, and the air was thick with the smell of tobacco leaves baking in the open. At 14, Sarah was no longer spared from the hardest labor. Childhood had ended, if it had ever truly begun. She rose before the rooster's crow, her stomach empty, her body already aching before her day began. The tobacco fields were endless rows of green, the plants rising tall and sticky with resin. Sarah's fingers turned black from sap as she stripped the broad leaves, piling them into baskets until her small frame trembled under the weight. Her bare feet sank into the hot, cracked earth, every step grinding dust into her skin. Overseer Daniels ruled the fields with a whip always coiled at his side. He was a thick, broad man with a face hardened by cruelty. The slaves feared him more than the master himself, for Daniels had no restraint. He cursed, spat, and swung his whip with relish. When Sarah faltered, his shadow fell over her like a storm. One afternoon, as the sun blazed overhead, Sarah stumbled while carrying a bundle too heavy for her thin arms. The leaves spilled onto the dirt. Daniels's eyes narrowed. "Pick it up," he barked. Sarah scrambled to gather the leaves, her hands shaking. "Too slow," Daniels growled, and before she could rise, the whip cracked across her back. Pain exploded, sharp and burning. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. Slaves learned quickly that tears only fed the overseer's satisfaction. But the second lash tore the silence from her throat. A scream ripped free, echoing across the field. The others bent their heads, their faces etched with helplessness. To stop working meant risking the same punishment. Sarah clutched the leaves to her chest, staggering to her feet, her back a canvas of fire. Daniel sneered, satisfied, and moved on. From the edge of the field, William Carter watched. Now 16, he had grown taller, his face sharper, his confidence bolder. He leaned lazily against a fence post, his fine coat slung over one shoulder. Where others might have looked away in discomfort, William grinned. Watching Sarah's suffering was, to him, a form of entertainment. That night, Sarah returned to her cabin in agony. Her mother, weary but tender, tore strips of cloth and pressed them to the bleeding welts. The pain was unbearable, but Sarah clenched her teeth, refusing to whimper. She didn't want William or Daniels, or anyone to know how deeply they had cut her. Mama Ruth, the old cook, slipped into the cabin with a pouch of herbs. She mixed a paste of crushed roots, spreading it gently over Sarah's back. "This will ease the burn," she whispered. "Don't let them break you, child. They can tear your skin, but they can't touch your soul." But Sarah felt broken. The pain was not only in her flesh, but in her spirit. She lay awake, staring at the flickering flame of the candle, remembering the smirk on William's face as he watched her bleed. The humiliation burned hotter than the whip. The next day brought no reprieve. Daniels pushed the slaves harder, shouting that the Carter family expected record harvests. The work was relentless. the air thick with sweat and dust. By evening, the slaves gathered the harvested leaves into curing barns, where fires smoked beneath hanging bundles. Sarah's task was to stoke the fire's hot, choking work that left her lungs raw. The barn glowed orange in the dark, his shadows flickering against the walls. William appeared again, stepping into the smoke-filled barn as Sarah worked. His pale face glistened with sweat, but his smile was cruel. Still standing after yesterday? He asked mockingly. I thought Daniels might have whipped the life out of you. Sarah kept her eyes on the fire, her body trembling. She knew better than to answer. Look at me when I speak, William demanded, stepping closer. He reached out and grabbed her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. His grip was rough, not the playful tug of a child anymore, but the tightening control of a young man learning to wield power. You're strong, he said, almost to himself. Stronger than most, but I'll make sure you remember who you belong to. He shoved her back against the wall, the heat of the fire scorching her skin. For a moment, Sarah thought he might push her into the flames. Instead, he leaned close, his voice low. Don't forget, you live because we let you. Then he turned and left. His boots crunching against the dirt floor, Sarah slid down the wall. Her breath ragged, her eyes burning with tears. She refused to shed. She stared at the fire, its flames licking the tobacco leaves overhead. In that moment, she felt the weight of her chains heavier than ever. But beneath the despair, something small stirred, a spark of anger, of defiance. The whip could tear her flesh. The fire could scorch her lungs. William could humiliate her until she felt like nothing. But deep inside, Sarah swore she would never let them kill the last piece of her that still belonged only to herself. The Carter plantation at night was a place of noise and shadows. From the grand house on the hill came the sound of fiddles, drunken laughter, and the sharp slap of cards against polished tables. Wealthy planters from miles around gathered there, wagering tobacco, horses, and coin in smoky rooms thick with whiskey and pride. The stakes were always high, but the men played recklessly secure in their wealth, their status, and the lives they owned. William Carter watched these games with eager fascination. At 16, he was still considered a boy in the eyes of his father, but he already felt the pull of manhood. He studied the way the men shuffled cards, the swagger in their voices when they laid down a winning hand. To William, gambling wasn't about chance. It was about power. It's about proving oneself. When the games ended, the guests would stagger out, leaving the table littered with coins and empty glasses. William would pocket stray cards, mimicking their moves by candlelight. But he wanted more than imitation. He wanted his own players, his own stakes. And for that, he turned to the one person he knew could never refuse him, Sarah, one humid evening. William gathered a few local boys on the wide porch of the big house. They were sons of neighboring planters, their cheeks flushed with cider and mischief. William shuffled a worn deck of cards, grinning. Let's have some fun, he said, his eyes drifting toward the yard where Sarah carried buckets of water. He called her over with a snap of his fingers. Sarah hesitated, dread curling in her stomach, but she could not refuse. Barefoot, dressed in her ragged work dress, she stood before the boys, who lounged comfortably in their fine coats. This here is Sarah, William announced. And tonight, she's part of the game. The boys laughed, intrigued. One nudged William. What can a slave girl wager? Her pride, William smirked. The rules were simple. Whenever William or one of his friends won a hand, Sarah had to obey a command. At first, it was small humiliations, crawling on all fours across the porch, fetching drinks like a servant, bowing low before the boys as they snickered. Each command tore at her dignity, but she obeyed in silence, her face a mask. When she hesitated, William's voice grew sharp. Do it, or Daniels will hear you disobeyed. The threat of the whip hung heavier than the night air. As the game wore on, the dares grew crueler. One boy tossed crumbs of cornbread at her feet, laughing as he told her to eat like a dog. Another ordered her to sing, and when her trembling voice rose in the humid night, they mocked the sorrow in her tone. William leaned back in his chair, watching with satisfaction. For him, This was not about cards anymore. It was about control, about seeing how far he could bend her without breaking. Sarah's humiliation cut deeper than any lash. Her cheeks burned, her throat ached from holding back sobs, and her spirit felt stripped bare. She thought of her mother, of Mama Ruth, of Elijah, and shame swept through her like poison. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the ground and never rise again. But she endured, because to resist meant pain not only for herself, but for those she loved. At last, when the boys grew bored, William dismissed her with a wave. "Go on, back to your quarters," he said casually, as though she were no more than a tool put back in its place. Sarah fled into the shadows, her bare feet pounding against the dirt path. She did not stop until she reached the safety of her cabin. There, she collapsed into her mother's arms. Sobbing with a grief too heavy for words, her mother rocked her gently, whispering they see only a body child. "But you are more than they can touch. Remember who you are." But Sarah struggled to believe. The echo of their laughter clung to her like smoke, seeping into her soul. She lay awake long into the night, staring at the wooden beams above her head, feeling the weight of chains she could never escape. Meanwhile, in the big house, William basked in the approval of his friends. They clapped him on the back, calling him clever, bold, a true Carter. To them, his cruelty was not shameful, but proof of his future as a master. And so the games of men became another weapon, another way to remind Sarah that her life was not her own. The cards were always stacked against her, and she had no choice but to play. Asterisk life on the Carter plantation was built on pain. But even in the darkest places, there were fleeting moments of kindness that kept hope alive. For Sarah, those moments were like drops of water in a desert, small, fragile, but enough to keep her from collapsing completely. Mama Ruth was one of those shadows of kindness. She was the plantation's cook, an old woman with a crooked back and hands scarred from years of hot ovens. Her voice was soft, but her spirit was unbreakable. Whenever she could, she slipped Sarah scraps from the kitchen, a heel of cornbread, a piece of salted pork, a spoonful of molasses. "Eat, child," she would whisper, pressing the food into Sarah's palm. "Don't let them starve the fight out of you." Sarah cherished these stolen gifts, not only for the nourishment but for the love they carried. In a world where cruelty was the rule, kindness felt like rebellion. Elijah, too, gave her strength. He was a year older, tall and wiry, his hands calloused from the fields. They had grown up together, whispering in the dark corners of the quarters, sharing dreams of freedom. Elijah often found ways to ease her burdens, carrying buckets when her arms trembled, cracking jokes to make her smile, shielding her when William prowled too close. His bravery was dangerous, but it lit a small fire in Sarah's heart. One sweltering day, Sarah faltered under the sun, her body weak from hunger. As she bent to lift another basket of tobacco, Elijah stepped forward, taking it from her hands. Daniel spotted him immediately. "You there?" the overseer barked. "That's her work, not yours." Elijah lowered his head, saying nothing. Daniels raised his whip, but before he could strike, another slave coughed loudly, distracting him. In that moment, Elijah slipped the basket onto his own pile, shielding Sarah from punishment. She looked at him with wide eyes, gratitude and fear warring inside her. That night, she whispered to him, "You'll get yourself killed." Elijah smiled faintly. Better to live with scars than with shame. Those words stayed with her. Her mother remained her greatest source of strength. Though age and labor had worn Ruth down, she carried herself with quiet dignity. At night, she sang lullabies in a voice cracked but steady. The same songs her mother had once sung on a slave ship crossing the ocean. The melodies were mournful, but they reminded Sarah that she was part of something larger, a chain of memory and endurance that stretched back generations. Remember this. Sarah, her mother, would whisper in the dark, "They can chain your body, but they cannot chain your spirit. You belong to God, not to them." Those words gave Sarah something William and Daniels could never take, but shadows of kindness did not erase the cruelty. They only made the contrasts sharper. For every soft word from Mama Ruth, There was William's mocking laugh. For every stolen crust of bread, there was the sting of Daniels's whip. For every dream, Elijah shared, there was the crushing weight of reality. Escape was nearly impossible. Cade's end, and punishment for trying was brutal. William's fascination with Sarah grew bolder. He no longer needed an excuse to summon her. Some nights, he crept into the slave quarters, demanding she fetch water or kneel before him. Other times, he lingered too close, his voice a low whisper, his hand brushing her arm in ways that made her skin crawl. Sarah's stomach knotted with dread whenever she heard his footsteps in the dark. Yet even then, kindness found a way to survive. Mama Ruth would press Sarah's hand afterward, murmuring, "Hold on, child. Night doesn't last forever." Elijah would catch her eye across the fields, his glance saying what words could not, "You are not alone." And Sarah clung to those fragile threads. One evening, after a long day of labor, she sat outside her cabin, staring at the stars. The air was heavy with the scent of tobacco smoke. Her body ached, but her heart felt lighter as her mother began to hum softly beside her. Other slaves joined in, their voices weaving together into a chorus that rose into the night. It was a sound of sorrow, but also of defiance, a reminder that even in bondage, they still had each other, and that no whip could silence their song. For Sarah, that moment was everything. The shadows of kindness were not enough to erase the suffering, but they gave her the strength to endure. And though William's games grew crueler with each passing day, Sarah's spirit, fragile, battered but unbroken, continued to burn quietly in the dark. The summer of 1847 burned hotter than any Sarah could remember. The Virginia air hung heavy with humidity, and the fields seemed to drink the sweat and blood of those forced to work them. For the slaves, there was no rest, only endless rows of tobacco and cotton. The overseer's whip slicing through the heat like thunder. Sarah's body was already failing her. Her wrists were raw from carrying buckets, her back striped with scars, her stomach gnawed by hunger. She moved like a ghost, barely able to keep pace with the others. Yet Daniels pushed her harder, sensing weakness, singling her out as if to prove to the others what happened when a slave faltered. One afternoon, her knees buckled under the weight of a sack. Daniels was on her in an instant, his voice a snarl. "Get up," he barked. She tried, trembling, but the sack slipped from her grip. The overseer's whip cracked across her shoulders. The pain stole her breath, forcing a scream from her throat. Again and again the lash fell, tearing skin, till the dirt beneath her darkened with blood. The other slaves kept their heads down, their hands working faster. To intervene was to invite death. But Elijah, unable to watch in silence, muttered under his breath, "Bastard." Daniels heard. He turned, whip coiled in his hand, eyes narrowing. "What was that, boy?" Elijah froze. Sarah's heart pounded. She wanted to scream at him to stop, to stay quiet. But it was too late. Daniels struck him across the face, the blow knocking him into the dirt. "You think you're a man?" Daniels growled, kicking Elijah in the ribs. "I'll show you what a man is." He raised the whip again, but this time Sarah, bleeding and trembling, dragged herself forward, grabbing the overseer's boot. "Please," she begged, her voice hoarse. "It's my fault. Don't hurt him. I'll take it." For a moment, Daniels just stared at her, a broken girl, begging for more pain. Then he sneered, shoving her into the dirt. "Fine," he spat. "You'll take it all." The next hour blurred into agony. Daniels lashed her until she could no longer scream, until her body went limp in the dust. Elijah was forced to watch, his fists clenched, his face streaked with tears of rage he dared not show. That night, Sarah lay in the slave quarters, her wounds burning, fever already setting in. Mama Ruth pressed cool cloths to her skin, whispering prayers under her breath. "Lord, don't take this child from me. Don't let them win." Her mother sat beside her, rocking gently, humming the old songs. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but her voice did not break. "Hold on, Sarah. You are stronger than them." Stronger than this? But Sarah felt herself slipping into darkness. Her mind drifted back to her childhood, before the Plantation, when her father was still alive. She remembered his laugh, deep and warm, and the way he carried her on his shoulders, so she could see the tops of the trees. He had been sold when she was 7, dragged away in chains, his face disappearing into the distance. That memory now returned, sharp as glass, and she clung to it desperately. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Don't let them break you, little bird. Even if they beat your body, keep your wings inside you." Those words became a flame inside her. The next morning, William Carter appeared at the quarters, his fine clothes untouched by sweat, his boots polished like mirrors. He looked at Sarah, bruised and bloodied, and smirked. "You're still breathing," he said softly. "Good. I prefer them when they last." The other slaves averted their eyes. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. William leaned closer to Sarah, his voice a venomous whisper. "Remember this. You belong to me. You're suffering." "It amuses me." Something in Sarah shifted. His words no longer landed the way he expected. Pain had pushed her beyond fear. Instead of shrinking, she lifted her eyes and met his gaze. For the first time, William saw not just a victim, but defiance. And though Sarah's body trembled, though her wounds still bled, a new fire burned in her. She understood now. They wanted her broken, silent, empty. But if she held on, even in pain, even if she died, then she would have taken something from them they could never reclaim. Her spirit, it was in that moment, staring at William's cold blue eyes, that Sarah felt the first spark of resistance ignite. The breaking point had come, and instead of shattering, something inside her had hardened into steel. The whipping should have broken Sarah, but instead it transformed her. She carried herself differently in the days that followed, slower. Yes, her wounds still raw, but her eyes no longer lowered in submission. Something in her gaze unsettled, both overseer and master. The other slaves noticed too. In the dim firelight of the quarters, they began to whisper. Old men muttered that they hadn't seen such fire in years. Not since the stories of Nat Turner's rebellion still haunted Virginia. Younger ones, like Elijah, leaned closer to Sarah whenever they worked, drawing strength from her defiance. Even Mama Ruth, cautious and weary, whispered, "Child, your spirit makes them afraid." Fear was dangerous, but it was also powerful. One evening, Elijah sat with Sarah by the edge of the fields, his voice low. "They want us to believe we're nothing," he said. "But when you looked William in the eye that way, it made me remember we're still people." His hand brushed hers, calloused skin against trembling fingers. "We could run. You, me, some of the others. We could make it north." Sarah shook her head, her eyes scanning the horizon. "They'd hunt us with dogs. They'd kill us all." "No, Elijah. Running isn't freedom if it ends with our blood in the dirt." Still, the seed was planted. The whispers spread quickly through the quarters. Not plans. Not yet, but the dangerous thought that maybe survival meant more than obedience. Some spoke of small acts of resistance, working slower, spoiling a crop, stealing food from the big house. Others dreamed bigger, of escape or even revolt. The air grew tense with possibilities. William noticed he had always enjoyed control, but lately he felt it slipping. Sarah's defiance rattled him. He found himself seeking her out more often, desperate to reassert dominance. One night he cornered her near the barn, pressing her against the rough wooden wall. His breath reeked of whiskey. "You think you're strong?" he hissed, his hand gripping her arm hard enough to bruise. "I'll break you yet." Sarah's heart pounded, but she didn't cry, didn't beg. She stared straight into his eyes and whispered, "You can break my body, but not my soul." For a heartbeat, William froze. Her words sliced deeper than any blade. He shoved her away violently, but as he staggered back to the house, a sick unease gnawed at him. He had everything: power, wealth, the law, yet one girl's eyes haunted him in ways he could not explain. Daniel's, meanwhile, grew more brutal. The overseer sensed the restlessness, the whispered conversations, the subtle shifts in behavior. His whip sang more often, his punishments harsher. He dragged an old man into the yard one morning, accusing him of laziness, and flogged him until his back was torn to ribbons. The slaves watched in silence, horror etched on every face. "This is what happens," Daniel snarled. "Don't think I don't hear your whispers. You belong to us. Remember that." But instead of crushing their spirits, the violence hardened them. Sarah, still aching from her own scars, whispered to Elijah later, "Every lash is proof they fear us. They know if we ever rise, their world will crumble." That night, in the quiet of the quarters, a small circle gathered Elijah, Mama Ruth, 2 younger men, and Sarah. They spoke in hushed tones about survival, about whether resistance was worth the price. "We got children," Mama Ruth warned, her voice low. "If we move too fast, they'll make us all pay." "We can't be reckless, but we can't keep living like this," Elijah argued. "We either die slowly under their boots, or we take a chance to die free." Sarah listened, her mind a storm. She wasn't ready to lead, but she knew her suffering had become more than personal. Her defiance had awakened something in them all, and in that moment, as the firelight flickered across scarred faces, Sarah realized the truth. The rebellion had already begun, not with weapons or escape, but with the refusal to be broken. The whispers of rebellion were no longer whispers. They were the first breath of a storm. They were the first breath of a storm. The summer nights in Virginia were thick with heat, but on the Carter plantation, something heavier hung in the air. Tension. The overseer had grown crueler, William more restless, and the slaves more silent. Their whispers now replaced with watchful stares. The air itself seemed ready to split. It happened one evening during harvest. Daniels was drunk, his whip swinging recklessly as he stalked through the rows of workers. His eye fell on Sarah, slower than the others, her wounds still healing. "You again," he snarled, striding toward her. "Can't even lift a basket without dragging us all down." Before she could answer, his whip lashed across her face. She staggered, blood spilling from her lip. Elijah shouted, "Leave her," and leaped forward, shoving Daniels back. The overseer stumbled, stunned that anyone would dare touch him. Time seemed to freeze. The other slaves froze mid-motion, their breath caught in their throats. Daniel's face twisted with rage. "You'll die for that, boy," he spat, drawing his pistol. Sarah's scream ripped through the fields. She flung herself at Daniels, clawing at his arm, fighting with a desperation born of years of torment. The gun went off, the sound splitting the air like lightning. For a moment, no one moved. Daniels fell, blood spreading across his shirt, his eyes wide with shock. The overseer of the Carter plantation was dead. The silence shattered. Some slaves dropped their tools and ran. Others stood frozen, staring at the body in disbelief. Elijah's chest heaved, his face pale. As he looked from Daniel's corpse to Sarah, "We have to go," he whispered hoarsely. But it was already too late. William Carter stormed into the fields, drawn by the gunshot, flanked by armed patrolmen. His eyes swept over the scene, the whip lying in the dirt, Daniels bleeding out, Sarah's trembling hands still red with blood. For the first time, William did not smirk. His face hardened into something colder, more dangerous. "So this is what your defiance leads to," he said, his voice low. "Blood, chaos, death." The patrolmen grabbed Elijah, striking him with their rifle butts. Sarah tried to reach him, but 2 men seized her by the arms, dragging her to her knees. William stepped closer, his boots inches from her face. "You could have lived quietly," he whispered. "Instead, you chose rebellion." Sarah lifted her head, blood trickling down her chin. Her voice shook, but her words were steady. "Better to die standing than live on my knees." A murmur ran through the slaves still in the fields, a spark of courage even in their fear. William heard it too, and it enraged him. He drew his pistol, leveling it at Sarah's chest. Her mother cried out from the crowd, her voice raw. "No." "Lord, no?" Mama Ruth fell to her knees, begging, but William's hand did not waver. The shot rang out. Sarah's body jerked, then fell limp in the dirt, her blood soaking into the Virginia soil. For a long moment, silence ruled the field. The slaves stood frozen, tears streaming down their faces, their grief mixed with fury. William holstered his gun, his expression cold. "Let this be a lesson," he announced. Rebellion will always be crushed, but as Sarah's body lay in the dust, a quiet strength stirred in the hearts of those who had watched. She was gone, but her defiance lived on in every scar, every whisper, every memory of her courage. That night, in the quarters, no one sang, no one spoke. But in the silence, they all carried Sarah's last words inside them. Better to die standing than live on my knees. And though William Carter slept soundly in his fine bed, believing he had silenced her spirit, he had only sown the seeds of something far more dangerous, because blood spilled on the soil as a way of feeding the roots of rebellion, and Sarah's blood would not be forgotten.